The 15th of December, 1943, 4. When German POWs first arrived at American camps, they laughed at reports of U.S. industrial capacity, convinced it was Allied propaganda designed to break their morale. Then they were taken to Ford's River Rouge plant and watched in stunned silence as a complete B-24 bomber rolled off the assembly line every single hour. But here's what really shattered their worldview. What did these elite German engineers discover about American industrial power that made them realize Nazi Germany never actually had a chance of winning the war? The winter of 1943 brought a bitter cold to the American Midwest that cut through even the thickest coats. Snow covered the farmlands of Ohio and Michigan, where new prisoner of war camps were being built almost overnight. America was deep into World War II, and captured German soldiers were arriving by the thousands. These were not ordinary prisoners. Many came from Rommel's Afrika Korps, the desert fighters who had terrorized British forces across North Africa. Others were seasoned U-boat crews who had hunted Allied ships across the Atlantic. Among them were engineers, mechanics, and skilled workers who had helped build Germany's war machine. They wore their defeat like a temporary setback, certain that German engineering and military genius would still win the war. Hans Richter stepped off the prison train in Camp Perry, Ohio, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. At 28, he had worked for BMW before the war, designing aircraft engines that powered the Luftwaffe's fighters. His eyes held the confidence of a man who knew German technology was the finest in the world. Around him, other prisoners spoke in hushed German, making jokes about American industrial weakness. "Look at their crude welding," Hans muttered to his friend Klaus, pointing at the hastily built barracks. "No precision, no craftsmanship. This is what we're fighting?" The other prisoners nodded and laughed. They had all heard the stories from Nazi newspapers about America's lazy workers and inferior factories. Surely the reports of massive American production were lies spread by enemy propaganda. The camp itself seemed to prove their point. The American guards looked young and soft, nothing like the hardened Wehrmacht veterans. The buildings were simple wood structures, thrown together quickly without the careful engineering Germans would demand. Even the fences looked temporary, as if the Americans couldn't be bothered to build proper security. But then came the first meal. Hans stared at his plate in confusion. Real meat, fresh bread, vegetables that weren't rotted or frozen. More food than many German civilians had seen in months. "This must be a special meal," he whispered to Klaus, "to soften us up for questioning." The next morning brought the same abundance. And the next. The barracks were heated to a comfortable temperature, while German cities froze. Hot showers were available daily. There was even a small library with books and magazines. Hans felt the first crack in his certainty when he realized the guards weren't trying to impress them. This was simply how Americans treated prisoners. As January turned to February, rumors began spreading through the camp. Some prisoners would be assigned to work details in local factories. They would see American industry up close. Hans volunteered immediately, eager to witness firsthand the crude American methods he had always mocked. He had no idea that what he was about to discover would shatter everything he believed about German superiority and change his understanding of the war forever. The truck ride to Ford's River Rouge plant took 40 minutes through the industrial heart of Detroit. Hans pressed his face to the window, counting the smokestacks that stretched toward the gray March sky. Dozens of them, then hundreds. The noise hit him first when they stepped out of the truck. A thunderous roar of machinery that seemed to shake the ground beneath his feet. Inside the massive factory, Hans stopped breathing. The assembly line stretched further than his eyes could see, disappearing into the distance like a metal river. Every 60 seconds, another completed B-24 bomber moved down the line. He pulled out a scrap of paper and began calculating frantically. 1 bomber per hour, 24 bombers per day. Over 8,000 bombers per year from this single factory. "Impossible," he whispered in German, but Klaus grabbed his arm and pointed. There it was, happening right in front of them. Workers swarmed over each aircraft like ants, each person knowing exactly what to do. No wasted motion, no confusion. The precision was breathtaking. But it was a different kind of precision than German engineering. This was precision through perfect organization, not individual craftsmanship. The American foreman, a man named Jim with grease under his fingernails, noticed Hans staring. "Pretty something, isn't it?" Jim said with a grin. "We're actually running slow today. Yesterday we hit 26 planes." Hans felt his knees go weak. The numbers were impossible, yet here they were, real as the oil smell in the air and the sparks flying from welding torches. During lunch break, Hans watched American workers eat in the company cafeteria, real beef sandwiches, fresh milk, fruit that came from California, thousands of miles away. The workers complained about the food being boring, tossing away half-eaten apples that would feed a German family for days. Through the windows, Hans could see the employee parking lot filled with hundreds of personal automobiles. More cars than existed in most German cities. An ice cream truck arrived at 3 in the afternoon, its cheerful bell ringing across the factory floor. Workers lined up with coins, buying frozen treats as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Hans had not tasted ice cream since before the war began. His hands shook as he realized what he was seeing. This was not a nation straining under the weight of war. This was a nation operating at normal speed, casually producing weapons of war while its citizens enjoyed luxuries that German officers could only dream about. That evening, back in the camp, Hans lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. The other prisoners wanted to hear about crude American methods and sloppy workmanship. Instead, Hans found himself unable to speak. The numbers kept running through his mind. If one factory could produce 8,000 bombers per year, how many factories did America have? How many more bombers were rolling off assembly lines across this vast country while German production limped along with slave labor and dwindling resources? The breaking point came on Thanksgiving Day, 1944. Hans had been working at the Ford plant for 8 months, watching bomber after bomber roll off the assembly line while his homeland burned under Allied attacks. The camp kitchen served turkey with all the traditional American sides. More food than Hans had seen at Christmas dinners before the war. Around him, other German prisoners ate, in stunned silence. After dinner, Hans walked alone to the camp fence and stared across the Ohio countryside. The math was simple and terrible. America was feeding enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. America was producing weapons at rates that seemed impossible, while its workers drove their own cars home to heated houses. The contrast wasn't just embarrassing anymore, it was devastating. "We never had a chance," he whispered to the empty air. The words felt like poison in his mouth, but he couldn't stop them from coming. We never had any chance. At all. Klaus found him there an hour later, tears frozen on Hans's cheeks. "What's wrong with you?" Klaus demanded. "You've been acting strange for weeks." Hans turned to his friend, this man who still believed German engineering would win the war, and felt a deep sadness for what Klaus didn't understand yet. "Do you know how many Ford plants there are in America?" Hans asked quietly. 43. 43 plants like the one we work in. And Ford is just one company. He pulled out his notebook, filled with calculations he'd been making for months. General Motors has 67 plants. Chrysler has 32. That's just automobiles, Klaus. They also have steel plants, aircraft plants, shipyards building vessels faster than our U-boats can sink them. The numbers poured out of Hans like water from a broken dam. He had been collecting them secretly, adding them up, trying to understand the true size of American industrial power. The results were terrifying. America was producing more aircraft in a month than Germany produced in a year. More tanks, more ships, more bullets, more of everything. And they were doing it while their people ate ice cream and complained about rationing sugar. The propaganda was all lies, Hans continued, his voice breaking. Not their propaganda about us, our propaganda about them. We were told Americans were weak and soft and divided. But weakness doesn't build 1,000 bombers a week. Softness doesn't organize production lines that never stop. The division doesn't feed enemy prisoners better than we feed our own families. Klaus backed away as if Hans had struck him. "You're talking like a traitor." he hissed. But Hans could see the doubt creeping into his friend's eyes, too. The evidence was everywhere around them, impossible to ignore once you started really looking. That night, Hans wrote in his secret diary, "Today I understood that we are not fighting a war. We are fighting an industrial colossus that could destroy us without even trying very hard. The only question left is how long it will take them to finish what they started." The ship carrying Hans back to Germany docked in Bremen on a cold February morning in 1947. The harbor that once bustled with merchant vessels and naval ships now lay in ruins, twisted metal and broken concrete jutting from the gray water like broken teeth. Hans stepped onto the dock carrying a single suitcase and memories that felt heavier than any physical burden. The train ride to Munich took 14 hours through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Every major city showed the scars of Allied bombing. Factories that had once powered the German war machine were now hollow shells with weeds growing through shattered windows. Hans pressed his face to the train window and counted the destroyed bridges, the bombed-out rail yards, the endless fields of rubble that had once been homes and businesses. Munich was barely recognizable. The beautiful city of his youth had become a maze of ruins where families lived in basements and ate soup made from potato peels. Hans walked through streets he had known since childhood, now reduced to paths between mountains of broken brick. The contrast with America hit him like a physical blow. In Ohio, he had watched workers complain about having only white bread for lunch. Here, children begged for crusts. His sister Greta met him at what remained of their family home. The house had lost its roof to bombing, and she lived in the cellar with her 2 young sons. When Hans gave her a bar of chocolate he had saved from his last day at the American camp, she broke down crying. She had not tasted chocolate in 3 years. "Tell me about America," she whispered as they sat by candlelight in the underground room. "Tell me what it was really like." Hans found the words difficult to speak. How could he explain ice cream trucks and employee parking lots full of cars to someone who had not seen fresh meat in months? How could he describe the casual abundance he had witnessed while his own people struggled to survive another day? Over the following months, Hans found work helping to rebuild German industry. He brought with him more than just memories. He had notebooks filled with sketches of American assembly line methods, organizational charts showing how Ford managed its massive workforce, and ideas about democratic worker participation that seemed impossible in the old Germany. Many other returning prisoners carried similar knowledge, and together they began teaching German companies new ways to think about production and management. By 1950, Hans was managing a small automotive parts factory using methods he had learned watching American workers. His children played in heated schools and came home to dinners with meat and vegetables. West Germany was rising from its ruins, powered in part by the industrial lessons that former prisoners had learned in enemy camps. "We thought we were the master race," Hans told his son one evening. "Instead, we learned that free people, working together with good organization and abundant resources, can build something greater than any dictatorship ever imagined." That was the real German miracle after the war.